I want to focus your attention this morning on Ecclesiastes chapter 2. 2 weeks ago, I started a new series entitled Life Without God. And I said we were going to be spending our time, 8 to 10 weeks or so, bouncing around the book of Ecclesiastes. And this morning, I want to read Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 18 to 23. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning in verse 18 and reading down through verse 23. I came to hate all my hard work here on earth, for I must leave to others everything I have earned. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they will control everything I have gained by my skill and hard work under the sun. How meaningless! So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of my hard work in this world. Some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. This too is meaningless, a great tragedy. So what do people get in this life for all their hard work and anxiety? Their days of labor are filled with pain and grief. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. It is all meaningless. C.S. Lewis said that human history is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. I think that's a great summary of Ecclesiastes. That human history is the long, terrible story of mankind, men and women, trying to find something other than God which will make them happy. That's Ecclesiastes. What makes Ecclesiastes, in fact, so timeless and so relevant today is that it rightly assumes that everyone, no matter who they are or what they claim to believe, everyone craves meaning and they spend their lives trying to secure it on their own steam. That's the assumption that this teacher, this writer, this psychologist makes, that everyone craves meaning and we will look under every rock and behind every tree to find it. We will exhaust all of our resources to try to locate a meaningful life, something that will make us feel like we matter. We all want our lives to count. It's a good want. It's a good want to want our lives to be meaningful, to want our lives to count. We were created for meaning. We were created to have meaningful lives. The question is, where are we looking to find it? That's the question. What are we depending on to make life worth living? What are we hoping will save us? Is it work? Is it our children? Is it romantic relationships? Is it beauty? Is it sexual pleasure? Is it possessions? Is it success, financial security, power, influence? I mean, we could be looking anywhere. And as it turns out, we end up looking everywhere. This is why I said 2 weeks ago that if I were to give Ecclesiastes a subtitle, it would simply be The Search. Now, I also mentioned 2 weeks ago that the key to understanding Ecclesiastes is to understand the phrase under the sun, which appears 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, under the sun. And what the writer wants us to understand about that phrase is that phrase really means this: the way life and this world functions and feels if there is no God. If this life and this world is all that there is and there is no God, that's what he means when he begins describing life under the sun, life without God. The writer to Ecclesiastes is not the first or the last person to identify life's meaninglessness apart from God. I was doing some research yesterday and came across a handful of quotes, some of which I knew and some of which I'd never read before. Bertrand Russell, who was an atheistic philosopher in the 20th century, said he didn't believe in God. He was an atheist, a philosophical atheist, and he said, apart from God, everything is meaningless. He concluded that life and this world is meaningless because there is no God. Even as an atheist, he understood that if there is no God, then ultimately everything is meaningless. Philip Appleman, who was an American poet, summed up where he believed meaning under the sun comes from. He was at least believing that there is such thing as meaning, but listen to how despairing his conclusion was. Whatever we are, whatever we make of ourselves is all we will ever have. And that, in its profound simplicity, is the meaning of life. More recently, Woody Allen was asked what he believes the meaning of life is in an interview, and he said this: life is a grim, painful, nightmarish, meaningless experience, and the only way you can get through it is to tell yourself some lies. And then this morning, I read a quote, actually watched a little stand-up bit from Norm Macdonald, who died last year from cancer, but a super, super funny guy. And in one of his stand-up routines, he said this. He was hiding under humor, but it's true. He said, when people commit suicide, no one ever understands, you know? I mean, when someone commits suicide, people go, I don't understand why. And I go, you don't? You think we live in a cotton candy house or something? You don't know about life? How it only disappoints and gets worse and worse and worse until it all ends in a catastrophe called death? Now, if there is no God, all of these guys are right. They're right. These are not people who believed in God. These are people who didn't believe in God, and they were making an accurate assessment of what life without God really is, what it feels like, how life in this world functions if there is no God. They're all right. Every single one of them is right if there is no God. Well, this teacher, this psychologist, I said 2 weeks ago that I like to think of him as a psychologist because he asks probing existential questions about the meaning of life, existence, those sorts of things. And this teacher, this psychologist catalogs, throughout Ecclesiastes, catalogs several of the ways that he tried to find meaning on his own, under the sun, without God. He looked for it here and there and everywhere. And one of those places he looked for it was work, which is what these verses I read a few minutes ago show. When we hear the word workaholic, we typically think of the corporate suit who spends 90 hours a week at the office. We think of someone who can't enjoy any other facet of life because they're so obsessed by their careers. And since that typically doesn't describe most of us, we think we're not guilty of workaholism. But workaholism is much deeper than that, and it really affects us all. In an article I read a couple years ago, published in the Huffington Post, the article was entitled, "Busyness is a Sickness." And the writer said this: in America, we are defined by what we do, our careers, what we produce. It's the first question asked at parties, and often the first tidbit of information we share with strangers. The implication is that if I am not busy doing something, producing something, I am somehow less than, not worthy, or at least worth less than someone who is producing something. Think about the word busy for a minute, okay? Over the past decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, the response to the question, how are you doing, has changed definitively from fine to busy. I'm busy. We're busy. Me, you, everyone we know is busy, and we're not just saying that. We are busy. Crazy busy. Busy with our personal lives, busy with work, busy telling people how busy we are, about the busy things that we're doing. We are all, in one way, shape, or form, addicted to productivity. Why? Because worthiness is synonymous with production under the sun. Worthiness is synonymous with production under the sun. The more we can do, the more valuable we are. The busier we are, the more righteous we will be. So however much we may complain about our overbooked schedules, exhaustion has become a symbol of virtue. It's actually become a symbol of righteousness. So much so that to take a break is unrighteous. To sort of go, I'm not working today. I'm taking a break. I'm shutting it down. I'm shutting it off. It's almost embarrassing to admit that to people. It's almost embarrassing. It seems so unrighteous. There is a level of shame attached to rest, unplugging, not talking about work, not doing work. Did you know that and I just found this out a couple weeks ago, did you know that our country leads the world in unused vacation days? Okay? Leads the world. To take a vacation is unrighteous. To not be constantly talking about work, doing work, what's happening at work, what we're producing at work, talking about our careers, our productivity. All of that stuff it's unrighteous to not be showcasing our productivity. To work and to work nonstop is righteous in our culture. This is one of the many reasons why I'm not terribly worried when people complain that preaching grace promotes laziness, which isn't true, by the way. But given our cultural proclivity toward overworking, a little laziness might not be a bad thing, to be honest with you. Shutting it down, unplugging, taking a break, resting, dare I say, sleeping in if you can. We look at those things as being so unrighteous. We're almost embarrassed. I'm embarrassed to tell people what time I wake up every morning. I'm not an early riser, neither. As I get older, I can't help but wake up earlier and earlier, which I don't like. But I value my sleep. And I don't like to start my day first thing in the morning. Well, I do, but not in the typical ways of getting dressed and rushing out the door. And I like to think and read and just sort of consider the day. And I'm almost embarrassed to tell people that because it seems so unrighteous. It seems so lazy. Now, don't misunderstand me. Work is good. Working hard is good. Work is something God created. There's some confusion with some church people who assume that work is something bad, that it's something we have to do here and now because of sin, but that's not true. Before sin entered into this world, Genesis chapter 2, verse 15 says plainly, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. God is not against work. God himself works. God himself took a break from working. After creating for 6 days, he took a day off. So God is not against work. God himself works. But we are told in Genesis chapter 3 that as a result of sin, work will now be hard and frustrating. Why? Why is it that sin so distorts the whole notion of work that from this point forward, it's now going to be hard and frustrating? Why? Because the constant temptation now under the sun is to look to our work rather than to God for things like worth, security, purpose, none of which it can deliver. You know, you've tried. It might work for a season. It might work for a time. But working hard, producing a lot, ultimately can't deliver what you want it to deliver, what you need it to deliver. Work and performance and accomplishment and success in this sense ends up becoming our God. It becomes what we depend on to save us, to make us feel important, to make us feel like we matter. But the more sacrifices we offer at this altar, the more it demands. For every hour we offer, it demands a day. For every achievement we offer, it demands 2 more. Enough is not in this God's vocabulary. It's never enough. Tom Brady, years ago, on a 60 Minutes interview after he had won his 3rd Super Bowl, got really honest. I forget who it was that was interviewing him, but he got really honest. I mean, this is a guy who at the time was at the top of his game, revered, respected by his colleagues and people all over the world. And during this interview, he said this: "Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there? I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what it is. Well, I've reached my goal, my dream, my life. And I think there's gotta be more than this. I mean, this can't be it, because this isn't what it's all cracked up to be. I love playing football and I love playing quarterback for this team, but at the same time, I think there are a lot of other parts about me that I'm trying to find that success in football hasn't delivered." Years ago, one philosopher said that the loneliest moment in life is when you have just accomplished what you thought would deliver the ultimate and it has let you down. Tom Brady understood that. In 2015, the UFC world was abuzz with one of the most anticipated fights in the history of the sport. It was UFC 193, and it pitted the underdog Holly Holm against the ultra favorite Ronda Rousey. I don't know if you remember her. But a friend of mine wrote an article about this. And he said this: Rousey at the time was a bona fide celebrity. Not only did she come into the match with an undefeated record in the octagon, but each of her victories were achieved with devastating efficiency. Rousey starred in movies, made TV appearances, and was easily the most recognizable face of the sport at the time. She was seemingly untouchable. So a bantamweight title wasn't the only thing on the line in this fight. It was Rousey's entire persona, her whole reputation, her identity, the hype of her ascendancy all hung in the balance. Well, Ronda Rousey lost to Holly Holm in embarrassing fashion. She was knocked out less than a minute into the second round. It was a shocking outcome, especially to Rousey herself. In one of her first public appearances since that devastating loss, she chatted with Ellen DeGeneres and made a startling revelation. Honestly, my thought afterward in the medical room was, what am I anymore if I'm not this? I was literally sitting there and thinking about killing myself. And at that exact second, I thought, I'm nothing. What do I do anymore? No one gives a crap about me anymore without this. I mean, after years of going undefeated, a single loss left her feeling suicidal. So don't tell me we don't locate our identity in our work. We may not be rich and famous like Ronda Rousey or Tom Brady, but we're all guilty of locating our identity and our worth and our value. It's tied some way to our performance, how we perform, what other people think about our performance. I grew up playing tennis. I grew up in a large family, 7 kids, so my parents had to buy a large house in Coral Springs, which is west of Fort Lauderdale. back in the late 70s. And with this large house that they bought came a tennis court in the backyard. I had never played tennis, never even seen a tennis court. I was 6 years old at the time. And my parents bought me a tennis racket soon after we moved into this house. And so I started playing, and I became good. Started beating my older brothers. I started taking it seriously, tennis lessons, tennis tournaments. I played tennis nonstop, but I had a problem. Every time I would lose a point or a set or a match, I would throw a John McEnroe-like temper tantrum, okay? I broke a ton of rackets. I would always yell. I would scream. I would just throw temper tantrums. And finally, my dad, the preeminent psychologist of my family, sat me down and helped me understand what it was that was fueling my temper tantrums. It wasn't just a lost point or a lost game or a lost set or a lost match. It was the fact that my identity was at stake. I had, even as a young boy, located my identity in how successful I could be playing tennis in my backyard, in tournaments with other people. My identity was being threatened every time I lost. Every time. If I don't win, I won't be respected. I won't be important. I won't matter. Now, I'd like to think that I've grown out of that, okay? After all, I was young and didn't understand these things, and now I'm older and wiser and, of course, understand these things at a very deep level, or do I? When I planted a church just outside of Fort Lauderdale in 2003, it was the first time I had started anything. I was relatively fresh out of graduate school. I had spent 2 years serving on the staff of a large church in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I got a call from a group of people back in my hometown of Fort Lauderdale asking if I would consider moving home and starting a church. And so I wrestled with that for a number of months, and in August of 2003, I moved me and my young family back to South Florida and started this church. And I didn't understand this at the time. I only understand this now looking back. But I was so tied up in every detail of the church that if the church grew, I was a success. If the church didn't grow, I was a failure. If people liked my sermons, I was a success. If people didn't like my sermons, I was a failure. If people liked me, I was a success. If people didn't like me, I was a failure. I didn't realize that this was in my early 30s, and I had so located my identity, my worth, my value in the success or failure of this new church that every time something went south, if the attendance was lower or the giving was less or I was getting criticized for something that I said, I felt like a failure. In fact, there could have been 100 people that could tell me after the service, I loved your sermon. And one person say, I didn't understand it. And even the parts I did understand, I didn't really like. And that is the comment I would think about nonstop until the next week. And so much of my preparation to preach that week was, I've got to do better than I did last week. So don't tell me we don't, consciously or unconsciously, locate our identity to some degree in the work that we do. I was experiencing what Paul Zoll calls the law of capability, the law that judges us as a less than if we're not achieving. So workaholism is not a matter of hours spent at the office, but an internal approach to life that seeks to save ourselves by what we do in the hopes that we will find what we're missing, something. Now, the more self-aware among us are at least aware of that void. And we're at least aware of the fact that we spend our lives trying to fill it. The less self-aware among us, They just go about their business and they pursue and they work hard, and they don't really understand under the surface why. What is it? What's actually going on at my core that is prompting all of this energy and all of this effort to be successful? What is it? Henry Nouwen once wrote, and very aptly, all day long we hear loud voices that demand, prove you are worth something, do something relevant, spectacular, or powerful, then you will earn the love you so desire. That's really what's going on. A longing to be justified. A deep, deep longing to be accepted, to be approved, to be loved, to be thought well of. Thankfully, that's not the way it is with God. Thankfully. That's the way it is everywhere else. That's the way it is inside me. That's the way it is in our culture. That's the way it is everywhere else. But thankfully, that's not the way it is with God. With God, love is not earned on the basis of our work and accomplishments. It's received on the basis of His work and accomplishments for us. In other words, the gospel is not good news for those who work hard. It's good news for those who finally give up on the notion that what we do defines us. That's when the gospel starts sounding like good news. That's what the word gospel means, good news. It's the good news that our worth and our value, our very identity is dependent on God's work for us, not our work. God's performance for us, not our performance. Jesus says in Matthew 11, some of my absolute favorite verses, come to me, all of you who work and are burdened, and I will give you rest. He goes on to say, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What's he saying? Sounds inviting. Sounds like something I want. What's he saying? He's saying that none of our work will give us the rest we long for. The rest we long for deep in our guts, the rest we long for can only come as a result of His work for us. So when Jesus shouted, "It is finished," from the cross, He didn't mean that we no longer work. What it means is that from now on, we work from acceptance, not for it. We work from love, not for it. We work from meaning, not for it. And that brings huge relief and rest to our lives because now we can enjoy our work without needing our work to save us. Now we can enjoy it without needing our work to rescue us from a meaningless life because our meaning doesn't come from under the sun. It comes from above the sun. Our meaning doesn't come from what we do. It comes from what God has done for us, His love for us, His acceptance of us, His approval of us, His delight in us, being connected to God. Our maker, our creator, the one who wired us and designed us as specifically as He did. That's what gives life meaning. That's what gives us meaning, not what we do. With God, meaning comes from above the sun where things run on grace, not merit, thankfully. Under the sun, everything runs on merit. Everything. You want love, become lovable. You want acceptance, do something spectacular. You want to feel safe, then be financially secure. I mean, all of that stuff happens under the sun. It runs on merit. But with God, above the sun, everything runs on grace. where people's value is not tied to their productivity, where the only work required is neediness. Come, you sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded by the fall. If you wait until you're better, you will never come at all. That's the good news of grace. Malcolm Muggeridge wrote this so well. You will be hearing throughout this series a lot of quotes. Okay, I love quotes. You'll be hearing a lot of them because, especially as it pertains to Ecclesiastes, so many people, artists, entertainers, philosophers, world leaders, political people, they've all talked, pondered the meaning of life. So you're going to hear a lot of quotes, and this one by Muggeridge is one of my favorites. He wrote, "It is precisely when every earthly hope has been explored and found wanting, when every possibility of help from earthly sources has been sought and is not forthcoming, when every recourse this world offers, moral as well as material, has been explored to no effect, and in the gathering darkness, every glimmer of light has finally flickered out, that's when Jesus' hand reaches out sure and firm. Then Jesus' words bring inexpressible comfort. Then his light shines brightest, abolishing the darkness forever." That's what this psychologist that's where he eventually arrives. If this is all there is, if this is all that there is, if this world is all that there is, if my life is all that there is, if there is nothing above the sun, only under the sun, if this is all that there is, then everything is meaningless. But if there is something, someone above the sun, that changes everything. If there is something that transcends this world, someone that transcends this world, that changes everything. So come to me if you're tired of the performance treadmill, tired of trying to make it on your own, tired of searching but never finding, tired of solutions that make your emptiness emptier. And I will give you rest. Let's pray together. God, thank you for your ongoing daily help. We need it. Where would we be without it? In Jesus' name, amen.